Hey Creeps, it's Horror Free for All. Continuing my passion project I affectionately call Gems from the Crypt, a series where I look at full length feature films that, in my opinion, resemble one of my favorite horror anthology franchises of all time, Tales from the Crypt. For this specific video today, we're going to be looking at a film from 1991 that was written and directed by a very underappreciated horror creator out there known as Eric Red. And the film in question is Body Parts. Now, Body Parts is actually a adaptation movie, believe it or not. It's based on a very famous horror short story called Choice Cuts, written by Below Narsajak. I think that's how you say their name. And Choice Cuts was a film for many years that was on Hollywood's radar to be optioned and turned into a movie. And after watching this movie and listening to the making of and hearing the commentary from Eric Red, who was basically a newcomer into the film industry in the late 80s, decided to pitch his own idea for Choice Cuts. And supposedly, the studio who made the film, I think it was Paramount, liked the idea so much that they gave Eric Red free reign to make this movie. And in the early 90s, Tales from the Crypt was coming out from the woodwork and was making a splash in media. And around this time, there's a lot of horror movies that really did feel like Tales from the Crypt because of how big of a pop culture phenomenon it really was. And this film, in my opinion, really does echo what was popular in the early 90s in horror. But more importantly, this film does echo a lot of things that you will come to notice in EC Comics / Tales from the Crypt media. And in my opinion, this is one of the easiest recruits for this playlist thus far to talk about, because in a lot of ways, this feels like a long lost Tales from the Crypt Presents movie. And if you haven't seen it before, and you're a massive Tales from the Crypt fan or EC Comics fan, you need to check it out. So with that being said, what can you expect out of Body Parts here? So Body Parts stars the very underappreciated character actor of Jeff Fahey. And he plays the main character known as Bill Cruikshank, I think that's his name. And Bill is a criminal psychologist who specializes in helping death row inmates. And one particular instance happens one fateful day where he's in a car accident and essentially loses his arm. And because his arm was completely detached from his body, he essentially needs a transplant immediately to keep his nerve endings attached within the surviving tissue. And if he doesn't do that, they're going to have to cauterize the area and he will never be able to get an arm transplant. But luckily at the hospital, there's this doctor who has essentially come up with this experiment to transplant an actual donor arm to Jeff Fahey's character. And let's just say the psychiatrist is kind of coaxed into doing it. And let's just say he gets the transplant. And we see that in a very gross and grisly fashion that his arm is completely fucked up and warped. And now he's going to have to go through grisly physical therapy to regain mobility. And after a while, he eventually learns how to operate his new arm. And everything seems to be fine and dandy until he starts having these nightmares. And these nightmares seem to be transplanting him into the mind of somebody else, perhaps the person who once had his arm. And in these visions, we see that he sees, in the perspective of this individual, of how he's killing victims, essentially. And this, of course, makes the main character, Bill, uneasy. And we also start to see him kind of lose control of himself and his impulses with his newfound arm. And his arm is starting to do things, or I should say violent things, towards people he cares about without him intending to do so. And it gets to a point where he's starting to worry for the well-being of others and himself. And he finds himself compelled to go investigate and figure out where his arm has come from, especially after he has an interaction with a fellow death row inmate that he, you know, provides therapy for. And there's a new tattoo on his arm that insinuates that the arm possibly came from a death row inmate. Well, in digging, he finds the person behind the research, and through a shady conversation, nonetheless, he figures out that he wasn't the only one that received a transplant from this donor. It was actually two other people that benefited from a transplant. One other person who's played by Brad Dourif, who received the opposite arm that the donor provided, and a pair of legs given to a quadriplegic gentleman. And from this point, the main character Bill decides to meet up with the other transplantees to see if they perhaps are having any weird things happening to them post the transplant. And there's a weird, camaraderie with the guys who all kind of feel like they share a part of a dead person that gave up this gift for them to have normal lives. But as the movie goes along from there, once we get the three gentlemen to finally meet, shit hits the fan. And let's just say there's a massive plot twist and recontextualization with said organ donor that perhaps leads credence to a scene very early on in the movie I haven't touched on yet, but it's insinuating that there's somebody looking to get their body parts back. And we see this happen one by one, essentially. And it comes down to a boiling point with the main character, Bill, where he has to kind of nut up or shut up and decide whether this arm is worth keeping and he should just remove it and possibly give it back to whoever wants it back, or keep it for himself and put a stop to this evil and perhaps put a stop to this connection he has to this organ donor once and for all, so he can maintain control and finally live that normal life that he's been working towards ever since his accident. And that's where I'll leave it. But nonetheless, that's Body Parts for you. I'm going to say this up front about Body Parts. And this is one thing that I have only said a few times in this series, but I guess I'll say it here. I think that Eric Red made pretty much a perfect movie, in my opinion. This is one of those films that is a genre blender, and it reminds me of what horror comics are generally able to do, specifically EC comics. You see, Body Parts here is one part horror, one part mystery, one part thriller, and one part crime. And when you put them into a blender, you get this neo-noir feel, but not really. But that's the beauty behind this movie, in my opinion. You can clearly tell that there's some exploitation elements from the 70s here. You can clearly tell that there is some mild giallo notes possibly sprinkled in here. And of course, you go back to the heyday in the golden era of Hollywood with noir filmmaking. But then you put this Tales from the Crypt-esque spin on the idea and, early 90s prosthetic and body horror effects. And, you add some twang of just over-the-top ridiculousness. And this is the type of movie that you don't expect to end up being an unintentional masterpiece. But here we are. I legit think that this is a perfect movie. Without getting too ahead of myself, I don't think that there's a single negative I have with this film. It's a brisk-paced movie, and clocking in at right at 88 minutes. The story's intriguing from the jump. There's lots of fun twists and turns, and where the story takes you is absolutely fun, and it gets really out there and bad shit. And I love it for that. But besides that, one thing I think that goes underappreciated about this story in terms of like the acting and what have you is the performances from pretty much the entire cast. I think Jeff Fahey and Brad Dourif are the easy show stealers in this film, and there's a lot of character actors I recognize from other films. Like, I believe the police detective in this film, I don't know if their name is mentioned on the back here. Forgive me if I don't know their name. But I recognize them from The Serpent and the Rainbow. And there's, I think, the female love interest character in this movie. I want to say she was in something that I've seen before as well. But I forgot what she was in. But she looked very familiar, and she gave a great performance as well. And I guess the villains of the story, to say that plurally, with like the person behind the experiments, and I guess the organ donor, let's just say, they were fun as hell when they were on screen. I don't think people give this movie enough credit for how great the performances can be at times. For how it looks and how it's shot, surprisingly enough, this was, I think, filmed mainly in the same exact location that the production company that made the 1986 remake of The Fly. Um, it's made in the same area, if not the same exact apartment that Seth Brundle's telepods were in The Fly remake, in terms of like um, showcasing, parts of the that movie in this film. Um, yeah, you see Seth Brundle's apartment, which is actually owned by Brad Dourif's character in this movie. And I think, this reminds me of a bygone era where films, or I guess production hands, if they worked on similar movies or knew people, they would sometimes, go through contacts, and that's how you ended up sharing set pieces within movies a lot back in the day. You don't see that often nowadays, because most of the time, if they do reuse sets, they at least try to touch it up and redo it to make it its own thing. And unless you've seen like The Fly, for example, you're not going to notice this about Brad Dourif's apartment in this movie. But seeing that stuff just makes me love this movie even more, because it just reminds me of how pretty much everybody involved with this film was a horror fan at heart, and they definitely kept it in like an inner circle back in the day, and it makes it that much more fun when you go to watch a film like this. And I really appreciated that about this movie. Now, looking besides, like, some pretty solid atmosphere building, where we get a pretty in-depth exploration into this hypothetical city where all the events of this story have taken place, with a really good sound score to boot. I think the body horror and the practical effects in this movie are top notch. It's not quite the level of Tales from the Crypt Demon Knight, with how schlocky and just fucking depraved it can get in that film or anything, but damn, there are some moments in this movie that really do make you squirm. And if you are somebody who is not a fan of body defilement, this might not be a movie for you to watch. Now, it's definitely more tame in terms of body horror films. Like, this is no Metamorphosis or the Natomorphos, whatever that movie's called. I've heard of some really underground, fucking depraved body horror shit. Don't get me wrong. This is not quite that. But even on the most tamest of tame adjectives I can say about this, it's still not that tame. So prepare yourself if you're squeamish about, like I said, body defilement. Because this shit fucking looked crazy as hell, and it was super fun to watch on screen. And if I haven't mentioned this, one last positive I have to say about this movie, of course, since we're talking about EC Comics and comic book horror love letter stuff, we got to talk about the underbelly, like I always do. And this is why I love comic book horror in a nutshell. But what makes this movie stand out compared to some others that I've seen, especially in these movies that feel like comic book horror, whether we're looking at Creep Show or Tales from the Crypt, is that this movie definitely has a couple of themes brewing in the pot here. Of course, there's an idea about death row inmates and the expendability of people that we have deemed not worthy of living, because we see directly and indirectly the consequences of people who live, I guess, honorable lives taking pieces of dishonorable people. And the dishonorable people, as this film likes to display, is that they change and corrupt quote unquote good people. And I like that message in the movie, because it makes you think whether, if this injury of this gentleman Bill perhaps has made him more jaded and more violent, or is it actually the appendage he inherited? The movie totes that fine line, and it doesn't ever actually say what exactly is going on. And this is one of the few times in horror that I've seen this approach done very well, where there's a dual interpretation and both make solid sense when you think about it. Now, I do think that at a certain point, the film does kind of lend credence that perhaps this organ donor can still kind of psychically manipulate parts of his former organs or limbs, I should say. I couldn't tell you the exact aspect to that because the film does kind of touch on these things, but it's more of a blink and you miss it type of thing. But what I will say is that the ambiguity does offer a lot of believability with it. And it's not something that you have to stretch too much disbelief to wrap your head around, which I really do appreciate on one hand. But on the second hand, my biggest takeaway with that idea was that I think it was a little bit of both for this character. And I kind of liked living vicariously through this man who already has a pretty difficult career as is, but then this accident has put him between a rock and a hard place, and now he's in this unbelievable fucked up situation that he can't escape from. It made the movie that much more harrowing for me, and I really bought into the suspense and the thrills of it because of that. And I guess one other thing to point out in terms of like the underbelly and the themes and layers and what have you is, of course, the idea of transmittal behavior and how things rub off on you in ways that you don't expect. Now, I know I just kind of briefly touched the surface on that, but this film is kind of a exploration into turning something bad that happens to you into a positive. And we see this happen with two other characters in the story where, as a juxtaposition to Bill's character, Brad Dourif's character takes his limb and starts selling paintings on the side and is building a successful career almost. And then the former paraplegic person who didn't have working legs can now play basketball again and perhaps can look forward to, playing professional basketball at some point. But what does Bill have to look forward to? His transmittal thing that he is getting from the situation is that he's become more violent and he's become more programmed to, feel these urges that he thinks that death row inmates, feel. And maybe it's perhaps that his character had an already good placement in life when he lost his limb compared to the other two. And I do think that the lessons that we learn with Bill here in terms of transmittal behavior is that it's okay to be changed by a fucked up situation. In the case of this film, it would be like losing a limb. It's understandable if you lose a piece of yourself and you take something from something else and you form a new person out of it through that void that was created by losing said part of yourself. And I think that this movie's weirdly relatable on that front with its idea. And never once in the movie did I doubt any of the judgment of Bill's character, because you can clearly see and understand and empathize with everything he's going through in the movie. And I really do appreciate that about this film, that it took the time to build this character up the way they did. And where they take him in the story is pretty cool. And almost kind of like an anti-hero type of way, or like a reluctant hero, but a hero nonetheless. And I feel like there's like a coming of age arc going on with his character, ironically, even though he's not like a young adult or a teenager or anything. He's like literally a full-grown adult in a full-blown career. But yeah, it made the movie hit that much differently, and it just feels unique in a lot of ways because of that. Which brings me to why I put this movie on Gems from the Crypt. This film, as if you can't tell, executes EC horror comics in all the best ways possible, intentionally and unintentionally at times. You see, Tales from the Crypt doesn't shy away from science fiction, horror whatsoever. And if you've seen Tales from the Crypt, the TV show, there's plenty of episodes with body part swapping and, sentient swapping and what have you. And this feels right at home with that. But this angle definitely serves better as a full-length movie. And if you told me, like if you put a blindfold on me and maybe erase my memory of this movie, and you created a fake poster and you made it look believable, and it said Tales from the Crypt presents Body Parts, and you convinced me that this was actually a Tales from the Crypt presents movie, I would 100% believe you, because from start to finish, I was thinking to myself the first time I watched this, all you need is a Crypt Keeper in the opening, in the end credits, and roll the iconic Tales from the Crypt intro and music, and people wouldn't bat an eye at all that this was a Tales from the Crypt movie. And I think what makes this hit home for Tales from the Crypt for me is that there's a good balance of humor and horror here, but the humor isn't too cheesy or try hard that Tales from the Crypt can try to be at times. No, it's legitimate and it's kind of earned at times. Like the funniest moment of this entire film, in my opinion, is when the main character Bill has his first original interaction with this said organ donor character I've been mentioning. And the way it's played up and shot is so fucking hilarious in that darkly comedic way that anytime I think about this movie, I think about that scene and it makes me grin ear to ear. Because, I really do feel that everybody behind this film knew what they were trying to do and knew what kind of audience they were trying to cater to, which I think really did help with the delivery of this film for me. And it sucks because gathering some information about the budget and how much this movie made at the box office, this film didn't make much of a splash when it came out in the early 90s. And I guess it possibly found a cult following on the home video market back in the day. And I guess when it got re-released on DVD, people went out to buy it, because I do remember seeing this movie at Blockbuster when I was younger. I just never checked it out because I didn't know what to expect out of it. But over the years, as I've gotten into being a horror fan and especially diving into EC Comics and Creep Show and what have you, I'm always looking for material like this. And when I was looking online, it seemed like everybody was recommending to go check out Body Parts. And I have to say, everybody recommending this movie, you're absolutely right. This is fucking fantastic. This was a fantastic film from start to finish. I love this thing. If I had to rate this film from a 0 to 5 star basis, honestly, I'd easily give this a 5 out of 5 stars. This is one of my, personal favorite horror movies that I've seen in some time. I'd put this up there with like Ravenous and Very Bad Things. I think that this is a very exceptional movie. And I'm quite honestly shocked that I loved it as much as I did. And that's saying a lot because I don't hand out 5 out of 5s all too much. A movie really has to appeal to me to do that. And, if I'm going to be a harsh critic, I could say that there are some slow moments at times with the film, but even the slow moments are really fun because they're building up tension really well. The story's engaging. You don't know what's going on, especially the first time you watch it. You're like, okay, let's get to the bottom of this mystery. And where it takes you, like I said, is so fucking batshit and warped that it's hard not just to fall in love with it. And that's the beauty of film. And this movie made me a fan of Eric Red, like 100%. I've gotten to the point where I've decided that I'm going to buy every single movie he's ever written and directed because I think this guy's a tremendous talent. And I want to see his entire filmography because of it. So take that for what you will out there. But yeah, this film gets a glowing recommendation. You have to go check this out if you're a Tales from the Crypt fan or EC Comics fan for that matter. Well, that's all I have to say about Body Parts here today. Let me know down in the comment section if you've seen this film before, what's your thoughts on it. If you have any films that you would like to see me cover in this playlist, feel free to drop a comment down below and let me know which films that you would recommend. I'm always looking for recommendations of other things to check out there. And until next time, take care.